Thank you very much, friends, comrades. It's a real honor to be here. Uh, so here I am, and let's begin discussing the world, which unfortunately I think is in a horrible state. But to jump a little bit forward, I don't think anything is lost, and we are fighting, and hopefully all of us will fight to make it survive. Let me begin by telling you something about a small but very significant academic program in the city of Beirut, Lebanon, at the AUB hospital, a program of which I am part of, together with the several doctors, some of them from Palestine, some of them from Iraq, others Lebanese. This conference is about peace and justice. Our program is called Ecology of War. What does it consist of? Basically, several reconstructive surgeons who are also very important Middle Eastern thinkers got together at the university hospital, and they decided to define what is war. And they invited me as a philosopher. I'm not a doctor, I have nothing to do with medicine, but they wanted to have few people like me to actually help them out. So here we are. In case you don't know what reconstructive surgery is, it is when they bring you people with absolutely destroyed bodies, with no faces, sometimes no legs, no arms. And these brave surgeons actually try to put the human body back together. So these people can go back to the street, they can have normal life, so children wouldn't faint when they see them on the street. They see and they saw all sorts of horrors that are taking place in the Middle East. And their conclusion after working in this depressing but also very brave field of medicine was that a war is not necessarily a flying shrapnel and bullets. A war is, and that is what I also observed in about 160 countries that I worked in, a war is when a human body or a human psyche is exposed to certain conditions that are similar to those at the battlefield. It can be a healthy body, it can be injured body, but it's a human body and it's also a human soul, be it a healthy soul or injured soul, a very damaged soul. When you go to slums of Nairobi, about 70% of the city of Nairobi lives in slums. You see basically open sewage, you see shacks, you see flooded streets when it rains. But that's not only it. You can, of course, see all this and you will say how terrible. But the horror is actually when you start interacting with people. 4 years ago, when I was making a documentary film for Venezuelan television station Telesur in the slums of Nairobi, my guide was a 30 years old young man whose name was Fire. Fire is a gangster. He killed several people, he robbed many people, but he's one of these romantic spirits who, despite his upbringing and past, still believed that there should be justice in Islam and that he himself one day could reform. After 2 days of working together, I asked him a few questions on the camera, and he sat down and he began to cry. A man of almost 2 meters height. He cried. I said, "Why do you cry?" He said, "I'm so old." I said, "But you are 30 years old." He said, "Yes, but I had 18 friends and they're all dead. I'm the only one who is alive." The next day I talked to the sexual worker in the same area, and she told me that any girl in her neighborhood who is 12 years old and who has 2 eyes and 2 ears gets raped. I said, is it really true? She said, yes, there is no way out of it. And rape in Kibera or in Matare slums in Nairobi equals death sentence because, the prevalence of HIV, especially at that time, now I think it's a little bit more under control, but it was almost, a gang rape was basically a death sentence. So this is reality of the slums, and this is the reality of how many people in Africa, many people in India, many people in Caribbean and elsewhere are living. If you implement the theory of ecology of war that we are now working on in Beirut, according to Dr. Abu Sita, my friend and leading doctor in this program, who is half Palestinian, half Iraqi, about 50% of our planet is still at war. Beirut is in the Middle East. It's it's a capital city of Lebanon, and Lebanon is a country, small country, with one of the oldest civilizations on earth. There are cities like Byblos, for example, which is together with Erbil and other places in the area, one of the oldest inhabited, longest inhabited places on earth. Middle East, and particularly the area in the vicinity of Lebanon, is absolutely destroyed. We are talking about Syrian war. We are talking about destruction and occupation of Iraq. We are talking about Palestine, which is very near Lebanon. Lebanon had approximately 1.5 million people as refugees. So the country of 3.5 million and 1.5 million refugees, most of them from Syria, but also permanent refugees from Palestine and refugees from Iraq and other places, but mostly these three countries. It is interesting that in Europe sometimes the governments and the people claim that they cannot absorb 1 million foreigners a year. And we are talking about a huge area and some of the richest countries on earth. The Lebanon was able to cope with the influx of refugees. Not very well, but it coped. It survived, it's still there, it's standing. And neighboring Syria is a country which used to be socially oriented, socialist, never ideal. It was never an ideal country, but it was a secular place. It was producing everything from science to very good level of education and so on. The West decided that it's too socialist. You see, even the countries like Iraq or Libya were too socialist for the West. Not that they were really socialist, Iraq or Libya, but they were actually too much oriented towards their own people. And so the West did to these two countries, to Libya and to Iraq, but also later to Syria, what it does the best. It began working on the regime change, on overthrowing the government of the country. And they did it in the most brutal, imaginable way. They implemented terrorism. They created terrorism. And they injected terrorism into Syria. Because terrorism is a creation of the West, including the Muslim, so-called Muslim terrorism. Where was the Syrian terrorism born? It was born in the refugee camps, such as Apayuddin in Turkey, near the city of Hatay. I investigated that particular camp, also making a documentary film, and I almost disappeared twice doing that. My colleague, Serena Lim, a Lebanese correspondent for Press TV, was doing the same thing from the north, from the Gaziantep area, and on the border of Kilis and Syria. She was killed. The terrorism was injected from these camps, from Gaziantep area and from Hatay, otherwise known in Turkey as Atakia. You see, Islam is actually historically, and you probably didn't hear it often, but Islam is historically a socialist religion. Compared to many other religions, it is actually very socialist in its essence. In 1940s, after the Second World War, three biggest Muslim countries in the world, Indonesia, Iran, and Egypt, were all socialist. President Sukarno of Indonesia was shouting at the American ambassador, "To hell with your aid, we are rich, we don't need you." He launched the non-elite movement in the city of Bandung in 1955. Indonesia itself, the greatest Muslim country on earth with the greatest majority, was destroyed in 1965 when President Sukarno, a secular Muslim and socialist, was overthrown by General Suharto, and about 3 million people died. 3 million people out of, at that time, Indonesia had 100 million people. So what was injected was absolute pro-market regime. Communist Party was banned. Communist Party was going to win elections in 1966, so the West was in a hurry to overthrow the government. So Communist Party was banned, Chinese language was banned, Russian language was banned, the art cinema studios were closed down, traditional local theaters were closed down in the villages. You know, Indonesia is a very old culture. It had stages that performed so-called katopra. Katopra was a theater where people would discuss on the stage a few times a week everything from the price of rice to corruption to the leadership and all that. That was banned. Everything was banned. What was injected was a Western pop music, Hollywood blockbusters, and the country went through something what I call cultural Hiroshima. In Iran, Mossadegh was a socialist who nationalized, the same as Ahmed Sukarno, all natural resources and was working for the people, for the children of Iran, for the poor of Iran, distributing the wealth of the country among his own population. Similar situation was in Egypt. You cannot imagine in the late 40s, I cannot imagine it either because I was born 2 decades later, but I mean, of course, I know all these three countries very well and I worked so closely with people there. You cannot imagine a group of couple of men coming into the cafe or restaurant or hotel with the suicide belt and blowing themselves there. It would be just impossible. So how did actually all this happen, that we now have this so-called Islamic threat or Islamic terrorism? Well, the West wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, didn't it? And so a part of the nuclear race that it triggered after the Second World War, because Soviet Union was actually standing by all the countries that were fighting for independence from colonialism, and therefore it was never forgiven by the West. So the nuclear race was triggered by the West, and when that was not enough, the most brilliant Western minds came up that it's probably the best to destroy the country in the toughest area of the world, which is Afghanistan. So here we are. This is how terrorism is being born. Of course, it all continued as a tremendous snowball. I followed jihadis from Indonesia who were fighting in Afghanistan They came back to Jakarta, then they regrouped all under the supervision of the West, and they went to do some killing in places like Poso and Ambon. Then they began a little bit too old, so they turned to teaching. They created absolutely new generation of fighters, and these fighters were sent to Syria, and they are fighting right now in southern Philippines. The last time I encountered them was in Marawi, in a city which was again designated for collapse because Philippines was actually also on the list of regime change attempts of the West. So here was a perfect scenario. How do we destroy the Soviet Union, and how do we punish historically Afghanistan? And so Mujahideen were created. Mujahideen, a most horrific terrorist organization, funded through the Pakistani intelligence and financed and also brainwashed by the West. Before that, Afghanistan was also an extremely tolerant country. It's enough to see the photos, and you would just not believe that we are talking about the same place that is now bleeding and which has now the lowest human development index in Asia and the lowest life expectancy in Asia, according to the World Health Organization. So that time, women were wearing knee-length skirts in the Soviet era before the invasion. They were going dancing, there were cinemas, there were Czechoslovak old trolley buses, connecting several corners of Kabul. People were educated, they were going to schools, women were teaching, not only they were students, but they were also teachers. Burqas were worn, but only in the very, backward societies or villages outside of Kandahar or Kabul. Then came the situation was created when Soviet Union was tied by agreements to the revolutionary Afghan government. It was a complex decision. Soviet Politburo didn't want to go in. They knew that it's a trap, but they felt that that's their obligation, and they went. What followed was an absolutely horrific defeat, because the Mujahideen's brutality and also its weaponry supplies were superior, and Soviet Union lost both the war and also morale, and it collapsed. Soviet Union collapse meant that the country descended to total chaos under Yeltsin. The life expectancy of Russia itself dropped to sub-Saharan level. The male life expectancy was 55 years. Pensions were not paid, crime was rampant, and that situation continued until Putin came to power and restored some sort of normalcy. But the biggest victim was Afghanistan itself. Under Dr. Najibullah, it was still run as a socialist country, but Najibullah was losing to this enormous terrorist force that the West unleashed in Afghanistan. And at the end, the Taliban took over the capital. They captured Najibullah, who was actually Pashtun, and he didn't believe that Pashtuns would do this to him, but he was captured, castrated publicly, and hanged by neck on the barbed wire. Since then, Afghanistan descended to total Islamist extremism, and that's precisely what the West wanted. Example of Afghanistan was replicated then in many parts of the world. The West actually supports the most extreme, most brutal terrorist organizations and religious fundamentalists. And it is not only Muslims, it is also Christian fundamentalism that is being injected to places all over Africa, Oceania, but also to Russia itself.